Its neighbours are foes or potential foes, but it has one friend in Jordan, bound to Saddam's country by mutual trading needs. Oil dominates Iraq's trade, but her export pipelines and her oil fields have always been vulnerable to attack. For centuries, the desert in what's now Iraq was barely disturbed. Oil discoveries changed everything. Britain drew the boundaries to define Iraq in 1921, and then its engineers moved in to develop the production facilities for the oil on which the economies of Europe and America were coming to depend more and more. As work went on to find and develop the plentiful reserves which lay beneath Iraqi soil, the country became independent in 1932. The land provided the labour as well as the natural resource. The seeds of discontent, though, were being sown, as much of the revenue which was generated by the oil business and the associated industry flowed out of Iraq. Agricultural methods were little changed from biblical times. So cash from oil was vital to lay the foundations of a modern state. The British had installed a royal dynasty. By the time the 17-year-old Faisal became king in 1952, instability was rife, the monarchy threatened, despite the respectful military trappings. Faisal and his cousin, King Hussein of Jordan, seeking mutual support, merged their kingdoms in 1958. For the mass of Iraqis, the monarchy and the oil business had brought little in the way of benefit. The same year Faisal and Hussein made their agreement, the army turned out to seize power. The internal upheaval had repercussions way beyond Iraq. It thoroughly alarmed the major powers, worried about their oil supplies. The American Sixth Fleet was ordered onto the alert. American Marines were dispatched to the Gulf. The French sent a battleship to the area. And British soldiers prepared for service in the Middle East. It was the first of many occasions that developments inside Iraq would provoke an international crisis. Outsiders' fears were centered on General Abdul Karim Qasem, like Saddam Hussein today, a charismatic leader whose popularity was assured, briefly, among a population weary of royal privileges. Qasem tried to calm the worries of other countries.
Our revolution is a real reaction against tyranny and corruption. Our foreign policy is to work for peace and cooperate with the other nations. We are friendly to all peace-loving nations on the basis of mutual interest.
But Western fears about Iraqi expansionism were well justified. In 1961, British soldiers found themselves called upon to defend Kuwait as Iraq made clear it planned to invade. Kuwait was part of Iraq when the whole area was dominated by the Turkish Ottoman Empire. Britain split them up when it drew its boundary lines in the sand in 1921. Large numbers of men and material were flown in. In some ways, it was an uncanny rehearsal for what has happened recently. Iraq wanted Kuwaiti oil and routes to the Gulf. On this occasion, though, Iraq decided the fight wasn't worth it. Kuwait was to be free for another 29 years. Qasem's revolution had been spearheaded by the Free Officers Movement, a leftist group that was to foster the political organization, the Ba'athist Party, through which Saddam Hussein eventually achieved power. Qasem's regime, having disposed of the monarchy, then set about cracking down on other opponents, especially the Communist Party. A series of trials was staged. Guilty verdicts were duly returned on those said to have plotted against the Qasem government. Onlookers dutifully expressed their appreciation at the end of proceedings reminiscent of Soviet justice in the 30s. Despite such purges, a flamboyant lifestyle was still available to some, especially the leaders of the revolution. For many serious-minded nationalists, the country was being led no better. Violence erupted again as young officers mounted a coup against General Qasem. This is an official Iraqi reconstruction of an incident in which Saddam Hussein came to prominence. It implied he actually shot and killed Qasem. He did try, but missed. Qasem was eventually dispatched by others. Once again, Iraqis were clearing up after a burst of military action, another coup. This time there was little talk of national interest. Qasem had fallen foul of his most dangerous political rival. His philosophy had been strictly nationalist. His opponents preferred a wider view of the Arab world. The new leader was one Abd al-Salam Arif, an army colonel. He quickly spotted one danger for himself in the sort of people now anxious to be involved in the jockeying for power in Iraq. Arif excluded from the government the Ba'athists, the party in which the young Saddam Hussein was starting to play an important role. Arif died in a car crash and was succeeded by his brother, Abd al-Rahman Arif. He continued to leave the Ba'athists outside the government. After all that party had done to change Iraq's leadership, such exclusion added to instability at a time of great uncertainty. A different threat to the politicians then in charge was building up in the north of the country. The proud Kurds had a long history of oppression, especially by the Turks in the early years of the century. They now resented control by distant Baghdad and began a virtual civil war which dragged on for over a decade. In another conflict on a much bigger scale elsewhere, the Six-Day War of 1967, when the Israelis launched a massive strike against Arab neighbors preparing to destroy them, Iraq's role was hardly glorious. The Iraqis promised King Hussein of Jordan that they'd come to his aid. But even though Iraq had troops stationed in Jordan, they didn't fight. Those who had and were defeated were bitter at Iraq's inaction. In Baghdad, untouched by the war against Israel, bitterness at that inaction eventually swept away the Arif regime. The Ba'athists finally seized power in the person of Colonel Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr. He would foster the career of Saddam Hussein and work hard to improve relations with France and Russia, the countries whose armaments would help to build modern Iraqi power. It was 1968, and the Ba'athists have run Iraq ever since. Whatever the ideology, oil remained the potential flashpoint for disputes with neighbors. In 1969, Iran laid claim to the Shatt al-Arab waterway, Iraq's vital tanker link. Iraq responded with gun